Hi and welcome. I'm Steve Martirano, and this is the Behavioral Corner. You're invited to hang with us as we discuss the ways we live today, the choices we make, the things we do, and how they affect our health and well-being. So you're on the corner, the Behavioral Corner. Please hang around a while.
Hey everybody, how you doing? Welcome to the Behavioral Corner. It's a little rainy today, so I hope you dressed appropriately. We'll get under the canopy here by the bodega on the corner. We'll be okay. I'm Steve Martirano, your host and guide through this. You know how it works. I hope you do. We're here to talk about a very broad topic, behavioral health, and that encompasses a lot of things specifically, and even more things in a general sense, because the way we behave affects everything. The way we feel spiritually, emotionally, and physically. It touches upon issues we often do of substance abuse and mental health issues. We're focusing, though, on an even broader realm, and that's what we know about our history. As a matter of fact, it is March, designated as Women's History Month. So I wanted to know more about that. We've been focusing on women all month on the corner, and I particularly wanted to know about women of color, because we know the story of the founding fathers, chapter and verse. We know their names, and we know Washington, and we know Jefferson, and we know Adams. But what I never knew a lot about were the founding mothers and sisters and wives. I had that smattering, same as a lot of you guys. We know who Molly Pitcher was. We certainly know who Betsy Ross was, and we certainly know Dolly Madison and George's wife, Martha. So we know all those ladies, and they all have one thing, several things in common, one of which is they're all white. So that can't be the case. Certainly there are women of color who played an important part in the nation's history. I wanted to find out about that. And so I got lucky, and look who wandered onto the corner. But she's the director of writing of the Mighty Writers. We'll tell you about that a little later. Kalela Williams is, as I said, director of writing, and she is our guest on the program. Kalela, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I got a lot of that right, didn't I? I mean, women in general are sort of left out of that story of the founding of the nation, and certainly women of color are almost nowhere to be found. So we're grateful to have you on that. A little bit about you. You're from Atlanta originally?
Yes.
How long have you been in Philadelphia?
I have been in Philadelphia for about 9 years.
Mm-hmm.
Crazy to think of it, but yes.
And one of these. Yeah, go ahead.
I've always been fascinated by Philadelphia, actually. Before I ever set foot here, before I even visited, because of the history, because of the history of people of color here.
Yeah. You know what? I mean, those of us who were born and raised here kind of forget the central part that the city played a couple of hundred years ago. Kalela is she's one of those rare individuals who's actually devoted to nonprofits, and she's worked for many of them. And of course, for her career, she's an accomplished poet and author, and she's written extensively, and her stuff has appeared in a whole lots of places. And she's now focusing with the Mighty Writers on a couple of interesting areas that she's going to tell us about today. The Mighty Writers, for people who don't know, real quick.
Sure. Mighty Writers is a Philadelphia-based organization that teaches kids to think clearly and write with clarity. It is an organization that provides free workshops. Right now, we're all online, but workshops, again, are free, and they approach writing from different angles. There's everything from, say, there's a workshop called Mighty Brotherhood, which is for Black men to come together and talk about identity and talk about issues that affect them specifically as Black men. There's Mighty Girls Rock, which teaches girls to compose music. So again, it's teaching writing, but it's teaching it from an angle that might capture a child's interest. And I right now am teaching what we're calling master classes, and these are for especially gifted writers. We're really getting into some detailed work with poetry and fiction. So it's a lot of fun teaching sort of, in some senses, in some ways, college level ideas to kids.
How old are these kids?
So Mighty Writers serves kids from toddlers to 17. The students who I work with, the kids who I work with, are 12 to 17.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had your your leader at Mighty Writers, Tim Whitaker, on the program, and we just jumped into it. I loved it because the group of most kids, but the kids you're dealing with have unique situations in their lives, and expressing themselves is one of the things that they're probably not called upon to do very much, and writing is a great way to get them to do that. So Mighty Writers is just a great organization, and more people should be aware of it and supporting it. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about your focus recently on women of color and history. You actually even dress up in costume when you do some of these?
Yeah, my interest in history it's a very old interest, fittingly. I recently, I in 2019, in January of 2019, I founded an online community called Black History Maven, and that was basically just a sort of way for me to, I was always posting articles about Black history, and I thought, gosh, I'm just always posting these on my personal page. What if I did this on, what if I created a page that was just about Black history, and I could post articles as I find them, and maybe spark discussion among more than just my friends and more than just my little circle. So I started Black History Maven. And I also thought about doing tours. So I started doing tours with Airbnb experiences. And I also did some community tours through Black History Maven. And these were tours focused on women's history, on African-American history in Philadelphia. And that the pandemic put a little bit of a stop to that. I had I guess you could call it a costume made, but my costume was, it's a 1778 costume, and it is, it's hand sewn. The person who made it is an expert in 18th century sewing techniques. And so there's just a lot there. But in the meantime, while I was waiting for that to be ready, I actually did some work with the Museum of the American Revolution, and I borrowed some clothing from them, also hand sewn. Yeah, so it's...
I'm guessing, this is interesting, when you talk about an expert in 18th century sewing, I'm guessing that most of the clothes that those people wore in those days were probably made by African-American women, right? That's an interesting question. I don't know if I would say most, and I think it would depend on regions. It would depend on regions, and we could sort of get into the nitty gritty of this, but a fair amount of clothing like if you look at the American South, a fair amount was made by African-American women, but a fair amount was actually made by white women. White women were expected to be, even white Southern women who we think of as plantation mistresses were expected to be industrious and frugal. And so in many cases, they used enslaved labor to do things that they considered sort of beneath them. And sewing wasn't necessarily that. But there is that being said, there is a history of African-American women making clothing. In fact, one of my favorite stories in Philadelphia is that of a woman named Emily Davis, who was just a simple, everyday person, nobody famous, but she left behind diaries, and she was a seamstress. So she sewed clothing for a living, and sort of glimpses like that give you an idea of work. Yeah, we're here to talk about women, but with regard to haberdashery, I may have this completely wrong, but I think I read somewhere that George Washington's tailor, I guess, became an international celebrity. I mean, he went to Europe and designed clothes over there. That's in the back of my head. It may have been someone else completely. Anyway, at the beginning, I mentioned that we know plenty about the founding fathers and very little about the women involved in that period of time. How sparse would you say our knowledge is of the women in history, particularly the women of color?
Sure. That is, again, a good question, because a lot of what we use when we study history, we tend to use written records. That's what we have. We have letters, we have diaries, we have newspaper articles, media, and women in general, much less women of color, were often not documented, or if they were documented, those documents were not necessarily saved. There was a tradition, for instance, of women burning their letters, because if you wrote something that could be considered untoward, or anything that just could be considered something that you didn't want left behind, you want to be modest. And so in many cases, women might have burned their letters, and we don't have them. So like, for instance, Martha Washington burned all of her letters from George Washington. So we don't have that correspondence. So yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of actors today, famous men, who wished the women they knew had
right.
done that.
Right. You can't burn an email.
Exactly.
Can't burn a text.
Tweets will get you every time. So it's
Right.
interesting. So the record is wiped out because of 18th century mores rather than anything else, right?
Right. And when we think about women of color in many circumstances, you either have a situation where literacy is limited. And remember, literacy was limited in all classes in the 18th and 19th century. But it certainly was much more limited in many cases by law for Black women specifically. So you have that. You also have just limited even just limited resources. Paper was not just something that you just grab, from the CVS.
Right.
Yeah.
So although the Federalist Papers have endured, a lot of papers did endure. Anyway, with regard to women of color in Philadelphia that you've taken a look at and are interested in telling people about, do you have a favorite? Somebody a woman who stands out?
Right now, my favorite, I would say, if I had to have a favorite, is I've been doing a lot of, there's been a lot of conversation about Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was a 19th century poet who no one ever heard of, or very few people have heard of. She's actually enjoying a resurgence right now, but she lived a long time. She was born in, I believe it was 1825, and she died in 1913. So she lived a very long breath of life. And she was an activist and a poet. She did everything from, she was a Rosa Parks on trolley cars that were desegregated. She would sit down and refuse to get up, because at that point, trolley cars were the segregation of them strictly limited Black folks' movement throughout the city, which meant they couldn't go to work, they couldn't do their own activist work. She also, again, was a poet, and she would host salons that would raise money for everything from Union soldiers to, during the war to after the war, to orphan children, you name it. So she was quite a and she was also a suffragist. She advocated for women's right to vote.
Yeah, must have been a real joy to be that far ahead of your time.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I'm not sure I've even thought about this myself. How segregated was a city like Philadelphia in the 19th century?
Sure. So there was definitely neighborhoods were a little bit more. The Seventh Ward, which at the time stretched from Spruce to Pine, river to river, was a I'm sorry, from Spruce to Bainbridge, river to river, was it was sort of a corridor where most African Americans in the city lived by the mid 19th century.
That's the ward that W.E. Du Bois did the studies on. Yeah,
that's exactly right. Yeah. And yeah, so most of Philadelphia's Black community was concentrated there. But that being said, you still could look at a census report from that neighborhood during that time, during, say, the mid 19th century, and you see a lot of folks who were born in Ireland, who were born in Germany, who were born in England, or who were born here but who were listed as white. So there was not as much of, say, like the enclaves that you might even see more of today. Lower Moreland Sing was in some ways, there were a lot of African Americans living there, but again, it was very mixed. I mean, what was segregated was not so much neighborhoods, but communities. So like, for instance, if you had a literary circle, that you'd have a Black literary circle, and then you'd have other white literary circles. Schools were segregated in many cases.
So we don't think about that so much. Segregation is something that only happened in the Deep South, but that, of course, is not the case. And the Seventh Ward is a very famous place for students of Black history, certainly in Philadelphia. Let's talk about. So have you led tours through the Seventh Ward, or you're going to do that again?
Yeah, I have. I was doing them quite a bit before the pandemic hit, and then I've stopped. But I will be doing some virtual tours through Black History Maven of the Seventh Ward, because it's a very important area. It really is.
Yeah, yeah, and it's been studied for a long, long time. I don't
Mhm.
know how much we've learned, but it's certainly been studied a long, long time. We're talking to Kalela Williams. She is the director of writing for the Mighty Writers, an organization that teaches kids to write. And she's, as you can tell from the name of the site, she's a history maven. I love that. I love that idea. You know, one of the other areas that we're getting to now that you've been involved in is the founding sisters, and I love that idea. Tell us a little about a couple of them.
Sure. So I have been. I also did tours on what I called founding sisters, women who were part of shaping. We think of Philadelphia as the place where America began, and women were part of that story. So there's a few people who are interesting. And what I like to do is tell complicated stories, right? History is best served complex. So, for instance, we can look at somebody named Peggy Shippen, who was the wife of Benedict Arnold, not one of our favorite people in American history. Peggy was sort of maligned during her life as being hysterical and crazy. And, I like to look at, we don't know very much about her. We have a lot of writings of accounts of how she behaved, but we really don't know what was going on in her mind. We really don't know what was going on. And so I just like to sort of, if I'm doing a tour and I'm talking about some of the crazy things Peggy Shippen did, I like to think about what is it that we don't know. We don't have her voice. And so, you know, what is the story? What's left out? And what could be something behind how she's feeling?
Well, can you imagine the stories that are left untold about a woman married to the most infamous man of her time? Uh,
Right.
that was a very that was a very famous family, right? The
Yes,
Shippen
they
family.
were.
Yeah, yeah. Friend of mine owned and managed a tavern at Fourth and Bainbridge or Fifth and Bainbridge back in the day called Shippen's. It
Mhm.
never occurred to me that there may be a famous woman involved in that. Uh, of course, the move a little further ahead. Of course, the Philadelphia was one of the terminuses. Is that a word? Of the Underground Railroad. Who were the women? And I'm sure there were women in Philadelphia who were involved in that.
Sure. There were so as far as the abolitionist movement in Philadelphia, it was complex. It was multiracial. There are a few women who just oh my gosh, so many people come to mind. I mentioned Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Obviously, she was involved. I mentioned Emily Davis, the seamstress, the woman who wasn't making a whole lot of money, but she was a member of the Ladies Union Committee. She was part of the Female Anti-Slavery Committee. So she was part of. She was always running around. She writes in her diaries about running around selling tickets to this benefit or that benefit because she was raising money for escaping enslaved people. So you have sort of people like you have people who are, I guess, flying under the radar as well as more well-known people. Harriet Purvis was the another person who was involved in that effort along with her husband Robert Purvis. Um, Charlotte Fortin, who was the daughter of one of Philadelphia's richest men, or she was the granddaughter, I'm sorry, named James Fortin, who was a sailmaker. She was involved in the abolitionist movement too, and she left behind journals as well. So we have so many people, just everyday people as well as more elevated names that
No. Well,
have.
yeah, I'm struck by the way the names roll from your tongue. I mean, there's so many who are literally lost, except to scholars like yourself and other real students of history. We don't do anywhere near a good enough job telling the story, the whole story of that period of time. This abolitionists, even in the North, this was a pretty dicey thing to be involved in, right? These women took some risk in getting involved in that movement, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, there's the risk of, obviously it was illegal, trying to help an enslaved person after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850 was outright illegal, and even before that, it was frowned upon to the point where you could be, I don't know, beaten. Um, there was the physical risk, but there was also the risk of speaking in public at that time. Being a woman speaking in public at that time, that was also extremely frowned upon. That was something you did not do. So these women, in some ways, and obviously the risk was more, or the frowning upon was bigger for white women than it was for Black women, because the tradition of Black activism was understood in Black communities. But it's to say that women were in some ways risking their reputation to do this, to speak in public.
And the other thing that strikes me, and it's obvious that even when we do know of these women and what they were doing, they are somehow, in spite of their efforts, somehow known because of their attachment to men. I mean, my guess is one of the most outstanding names of the founding period of a woman of color is Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings was, like thousands of other women, a piece of property. She was owned, but she was owned by a very famous man, and he fathered some of her children. So these women all had, in addition to that, if they were carrying around that weight. It's my husband. The only reason they're paying attention to me is my husband. We need to break free of that and just look at them as individuals and what they were doing. I mean, that's part of, I'm sure, what you want to accomplish with this, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think to some extent, of course, we still see that today. But I think that that certainly looking at women through the attachment of either their husbands, their brothers, their fathers, or the attachment of, in Sally Hemings' case, which was a very unique case, she was, yes, indeed, the mother of at least 4 of Thomas Jefferson's children. And she's someone interesting who I like to talk about when I'm standing at the Declaration House on 7th and Market. It's a rebuilt Declaration House. It's not the original, of course. It was rebuilt in the 1930s, but she probably, we don't have any record of her necessarily being in Philadelphia ever. Even when she sailed to France, it doesn't seem like she went through Philadelphia. But we do know that when Thomas Jefferson was in that Declaration House, Robert Hemmings, her brother, was with him. And the Hemmings family is part of the Jefferson family. And Sally's story brings us to another point about women of color's history, and that is the idea of assault, in sexual assault in women's history. And I'd like to talk about this on tours because I think it's important that to stress that all women were in danger of sexual assault at that time. All women were, especially women who were indentured servants, women who were poor, and especially women who were African American, and especially women who were owned by other people. When you don't own your body, it's very hard to. It's obviously you can't. The idea of consent is out of the window. So it's important to talk about these things. It's important to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's awful to think about something like that. I mean, you're right about across the board, women were considered property, even if they were free white women. They sort of belonged to their husbands. So the idea of consent may not have been. I mean, not that they acquiesced to any of this behavior, but it certainly wouldn't be the first thing in their mind is I didn't consent to this. Was sort of what was to be expected and endured. It's horrible just to contemplate that. So the people you lead on these tours, are they of all ages, or are they younger people, or who are you taking on these tours when you were doing them?
Generally adults, but I will say that I love when kids are part of these tours. I will be more patient, not more patient, not that I'm usually impatient. Come on. No, I'm not like that.
Right,
But,
right.
but I will re-explain things as needed. I will make sure that I always like to make sure that the child understands. I want to make sure that the child comes away with, and even if other people in the tour are sort of, and usually this doesn't happen, usually people are not annoyed at all, but I want to make sure that the child comes away with an understanding, because that's important to me. And yeah, so yeah.
Are they surprised to find out that there were so many people of color who were involved in those days and had an impact?
Yeah, I think that, when we learn about, one of the reasons I mentioned that I was fascinated with Philadelphia before I ever set foot in this city, because I had always heard the narrative. You grow up in the South and you always hear the narrative of slavery and go down Moses, and you just hear this like 19th century cotton farm, cotton plantation narrative. And it's so much bigger than that. And Philadelphia being a place where there was a thriving free community really was at odds of everything I ever learned in school. And so I wanted to learn more. And so I think that's what surprises people. I think that people just sort of forget that that Black folks existed outside of slavery, that Black folks existed in the 18th century and not just the 19th century.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can certainly appreciate that. It doesn't. I don't want to get too much into this, but I'm curious.
Sure.
I spent time in Boston working, and Boston is very similar to Philadelphia, that historical roots thing. But they seemed, this just may be my ignorance, Boston seemed to be more inclined to bring people through that history. I mean, there's the famous Freedom Trail, where these tour that they've been doing forever there. Is the city up to speed on the kind of things you do?
It's been a lot. I have not spent a lot of time in Boston for a while. I would like to, and that was actually on my list of things to do before the pandemic hit. Because I haven't really spent time in Boston for about 15 years. And 15 years is a
Oh yeah.
long time when it comes to interpreting Black history.
All right, then I got to ask you about the one other area here, because it leaped off the page at me when I saw the tour, and that is scandals.
Yeah.
You got to tell us what
Sure.
sort of scandals were going on.
Oh my goodness. Everything from Alexander Hamilton's affair to obviously I do talk about Peggy Shippen, because that is just so incredibly interesting. And during the Scandals tour, I also talk about things that we consider taboo, and that we consider not something that we like to talk about. So for instance, sex work in the 18th and 19th century, looking at that reality, looking at stories where looking at, say, like Ben Franklin's many divergences, we'll call them, sort of looking at them not through the lens of this is salacious, but through the lens of people were human beings, and this is how human beings behave. And one of the interesting things about this was I had a teenager take that tour once. And the mom reached out to me and she was like, "Is it okay if my teen comes?" And I was like, ooh. And I said, "I'm going to tell you everything this is what we talk about. That is up to you." And the kid came along, and I just tried to pretend like he wasn't there in that case, because I didn't want to sort of like not say anything. And then when the tour was done, he was like, "I didn't know history was like this. I think I want to, or can you send me some articles? Like, where can I learn more about this? I want to learn this in history class." And I'm like, "I don't know if we're going to ever learn this in class, but I will send you articles."
well, you know that if you were to put revolutionary scandals on a list of courses, people would sign up for it. It's a fascinating idea. Let's focus again back on women at this time. You mentioned sex work, which is kind of interesting. Now we know that sex work is sex work. It's not any profession anybody aspires to. But for many women, it was the first. I'm guessing it was the first expression they had of some kind of independence. They could take what was usually taken from them, turn it into a commodity, and make some money. Were women of color involved in a lot of sex work during the Revolutionary period?
So we don't know. I mean, sex work is definitely something that that was pretty widespread throughout, certainly throughout American history. It doesn't in Philadelphia. It doesn't seem that women of color were more involved or less involved. It seems like it was if anything, from what I have seen, and obviously the records on this are very, very shadowy. But I will say that from what I've seen, it seems like they were not disproportionately represented in sex work. But I do, going back to the idea of sex work, it seems, just as it does now, it means different things to different people. For some, it is empowering to be able to earn your own money. And in that time, especially when there's very few avenues, it could have been. But for many, it was also it was the only thing you could do. And it was incredibly, and still is in many cases, it can be incredibly dangerous work in many, many different ways. So yeah, I think it's important to look at it in a holistic way, and looking at it from the lens of, this is part of the economic reality of women, just as there's other professions that were part of the economic reality of women.
Yeah, Kalela Williams talking to us about women in history, women of color, and their role with a focus on Philadelphia, because that's where she does her work. It's fascinating. I mean, the story is so much bigger than what we've been told, even in fairly serious discussions and study of the history of this country. It's way bigger than we're aware of. So stuff like your work is particularly important. Before I'm going to close up here with a question, and I think I know the answer. You're a fan of Hamilton? The
musical?
Yes.
I am a fan. I'm not
as a historian.
Yes, I'm not a super fan. I'm not. I definitely don't listen to the soundtrack over and over. But I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the take on history, and anything that makes history more accessible and more interesting to people, I'm all for.
Yeah, you're okay about. I get it. You're not falling down about this. My problem has always been Hamilton. I don't know. They told us some other story of Hamilton when I was growing up.
Right.
I don't understand. So anyway, what should people do if they want to know more about your individual work? Your website is your name, correct?
My website is my name, and I also have blackhistorymaven.com. Blackhistorymaven.com. Yeah.
I would, I've looked at both sites. They're fascinating. I would urge people to do that. And the Mighty Writers is also there on the internet. You can look them up. They are, as I said, a nonprofit, so they're dependent upon contributions. It's a great way to spend some money if you got some extra money. Kalela, thanks so much. Could you do me a favor and promise to come back and talk about this again, but in costume?
I certainly can. Yes, I certainly can. I had a bunch of meetings. It takes me about an hour and a half to get dressed because I'm just not very good with the stays yet. But yes, I'm getting there.
Is that longer than it takes you regularly to get dressed? Or
oh my God, yeah. Are you kidding me? Usually I'm just like, I sometimes don't even look in the mirror. But it's bad. That's not true at all. Kalela Williams, thanks so much. You're welcome.
And I can't wait until the pandemic gets out of all of our ways, and then you can get back to doing some of these great tours. Thanks again. We appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. Have a great afternoon.
At Retreat Behavioral Health, we believe in the power of connection and quality care. We offer comprehensive, holistic, and compassionate treatment from industry-leading experts. Call 855-802-6600 and begin your journey today.
That's it for now. And make us a habit, hanging out at the Behavioral Corner. And when we're not hanging, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter on the Behavioral Corner.